I've always felt that trees are much better conversationalists than people. They don't expect you to make eye contact, they don't fill the air with awkward small talk, and they certainly don't judge you if you take a long pause before deciding how to respond. My name is Raven, and I spend most of my life covered in a fine layer of sawdust that feels more like a second skin than a nuisance. I'm a woodworker. To be more specific, I'm a furniture maker who prefers the company of a century-old oak plank to anyone with a pulse. My workshop is tucked away at the edge of a small town in the Pacific Northwest, where the mist hangs heavy over the Douglas firs and the world usually stays quiet enough for me to hear my own thoughts. People think being shy is just about being quiet, but it's more. Like living behind a thick pane of glass. You can see everyone else laughing and connecting, but when you try to join in, your words get stuck in your throat like a splinter you can't quite reach. I've lost more commissions than I can count because I couldn't find the courage to sell myself. A customer would walk in, ask about a custom dining table, and I'd end up staring at my boots, mumbling something about joinery until they got bored and left. It's not that I don't have things to say, it's just that my brain decides to go on strike the moment someone looks at me with expectation. Lately, things have been getting tough. The bills are piling up on my workbench next to my chisels, and there's a new guy in town named Marcus, who is everything I'm not. He opened a sleek, modern showroom. Right on Main Street. He's loud, he's charismatic, and he's excellent at telling people exactly what they want to hear, even if his craftsmanship is, well, let's just say he uses more wood filler than actual wood. He's been taking all the big local projects, and my quiet little shop is starting to feel like a sinking ship. My heart sinks every time I walk past his windows and see him shaking hands and laughing with the town's wealthiest residents. I want to tell them that his dovetails won't hold for 5 years, but the words just won't come out. The smell of cedar is the only thing that keeps me grounded. When I pick up my hand plane and start taking thin, translucent curls off a board, the world finally makes sense. There's a rhythm to it, a song that the wood sings when it's treated. Right. But you can't pay rent with cedar curls. My landlord, Mr. Henderson, stopped by yesterday. He's a kind man, but he's also a businessman. He told me that if I can't catch up on the back rent by the end of the month, he's going to have to lease my space to Marcus, who wants to turn it into a warehouse for his mass-produced chairs. The thought of Marcus's cheap, stapled furniture sitting where my father's workbench stands makes my stomach turn. I had to do something, but the very thought of stepping out into the spotlight makes my hands shake worse than a malfunctioning orbital sander. I spent the whole night staring at the ceiling, the smell of linseed oil still clinging to my skin. The thought of losing my shop to someone like Marcus was like a physical weight on my chest. I'm Raven, and most days I feel more like a shadow that just happens to know how to use a table saw. I knew I couldn't just sit there and wait for the eviction notice to slide under the door. I needed a miracle. That's when I saw the flyer at the hardware store. It was bright yellow, the Emerald Coast Woodworking Invitational. It wasn't just a fair, it was a live competition held right in the town square. The prize money was exactly what I needed to clear my debt. But there was a catch, a huge, terrifying catch. It was a live build. That meant people watching. Hundreds of eyes tracking every move of my chisel. My first instinct was to turn around and walk away so fast I'd leave skid marks. My shyness isn't just nerves, it's a full-body blackout. When people watch me work, my hands feel like they're made of lead. But then I saw Marcus coming out of his showroom. He was holding the same flyer, smirking at it like he'd already won. He saw me and gave that condescending little wave, the one that says, "Oh look, the little girl is playing with splinters again." He didn't say a word, but his eyes said it all. He thought I was a joke. He thought my silence was weakness. That was the moment something inside me snapped. It wasn't a loud snap, more like the subtle click of a well-fitted joint, but it was there. I was going to enter that competition. I spent the next week in a fever dream. I stopped answering the phone and focused entirely on my design. If I was going to do this, I couldn't just build a chair. I had to build something that spoke for me. I chose a piece of rare, figured walnut I'd been saving for years. It had deep, swirling grains that looked like a stormy ocean. I decided to build a spirit cabinet, a piece with hidden drawers and seamless joints that relied on pure precision. No nails, no screws, just the friction and the fit. The morning of the competition arrived, and the town square was a zoo. My station was right next to Marcus's. Of course it was. He had a team of 2 assistants helping him unload these massive slabs of pre-sanded maple. He was already talking to a local news crew, flashing his teeth and talking about the soul of the timber. I felt like I was shrinking with every word he spoke. I pulled my old, dented truck up to my spot, my heart hammering against my ribs. I stepped out, clutching my toolbox, and immediately tripped over a power cord. A few people laughed. I felt my face turn that familiar, scorching shade of crimson. "Just look at the wood, Raven," I whispered to myself. "Don't look at the people, just the wood." The air in the square was thick with the scent of fresh-cut pine and the electric hum of anticipation. When the head judge blew the whistle to start the clock, the world around me dissolved into a blur of motion. I could hear the roar of Marcus's industrial sander next door, a loud, aggressive sound that seemed to match his personality. He was working fast, shouting instructions to his assistants, playing to the crowd that had gathered around his booth. I, on the other hand, picked up my marking gauge and a pencil. My hands were still trembling, making it hard to scribe the lines for my first set of dovetails. Every time a shadow fell across my workbench, I knew someone was standing there, watching me, and my stomach would do a nervous little flip. "Look at her," I heard a voice whisper from the crowd. "She's using hand tools. Does she even know there's a clock running?" I kept my head down, my hair falling forward to act as a curtain between me and the world. I wanted to tell them that hand-cut joinery has a soul that a machine can't replicate, but the iron gate in my throat was locked tight. I focused on the walnut. The wood was cold and dense, resisting the blade just enough to remind me it was once a living thing. As I made the first cut with my Japanese pull saw, the familiar rhythm began to take over. The thin, rhythmic shick-shick-shick of the blade became my heartbeat. For a few minutes, I forgot about the debt, the landlord, and the hundreds of eyes boring into my back. But the peace didn't last. About 2 hours in, the judges made their first round. There were 3 of them, led by a man named Mr. Abernathy, who looked like he had been carved out of a piece of old hickory himself. He stood at the edge of my station, his shadow looming over my work. "Specialist Raven, isn't it?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I froze, the saw mid-stroke. I looked up for a split second, saw his stern face, and immediately looked back at the wood. I tried to say, "Yes, sir," but it came out as a tiny, pathetic squeak. I felt the heat rising in my neck again. Marcus, sensing my struggle from the next booth, laughed loudly. "She doesn't talk much, Judge. She lets her splinters do the talking." The crowd laughed, and I felt a tear prick the corner of my eye. I squeezed the handle of my saw so hard my knuckles turned white. Mr. Abernathy didn't laugh. He leaned in closer, inspecting the layout of my hidden drawers. "This is an ambitious design for an 8-hour build, young lady. If your tolerances are off by even a hair, the whole thing will seize up when the humidity hits it. Are you sure you shouldn't simplify?" I wanted to explain my theory on wood movement, to tell him that I had accounted for the grain direction of the internal runners. But the words were a jumble in my head. I just gave a stiff, jerky nod. He sighed, made a note on his clipboard, and moved on. I felt like a failure before the glue was even out of the bottle. By the 4th hour, the sun was high over the square, and the heat was making the air feel thick. My apron was damp with sweat, and a fine layer of walnut dust had settled into the creases of my skin. Around me, the noise was deafening. Marcus was now using a heavy-duty router, the high-pitched scream of the machine cutting through the air like a siren. He was making a show of it, blowing wood chips toward the front row of the crowd and winking at a group of tourists. I tried to tune him out, but my shyness makes me hyper-aware of everything. Every laugh from the crowd felt like a comment on my slow progress. Every time someone pointed at my hand chisels, I felt like an artifact in a museum rather than a competitor. I reached for my favorite mallet, the one my father made from a gnarly piece of Osage orange. I needed to seat the first set of dovetails for the cabinet's main frame. This was the moment of truth. If my layout was even a fraction of a millimeter off, the wood would split under the pressure, and I'd be out of the competition. I held the pieces together, my heart thumping against my ribs. I could feel the eyes of the crowd on me, waiting for me to fail, waiting for the girl who couldn't speak to finally break. I took a deep breath, trying to find that quiet place inside me where the wood and I were the only things that existed. Just as I raised the mallet, a loud bang erupted from Marcus's booth. One of his assistants had dropped a heavy maple slab, and the sound was like a gunshot. I flinched, my hand slipping just as the mallet descended. The blow landed at an awkward angle. My heart stopped. I looked down, expecting to see a jagged crack running through my precious walnut. The crowd gasped, and for a second, the square went silent. I felt the hot sting of embarrassment flooding my face. I wanted to crawl under my workbench and disappear. Marcus didn't even apologize. He just laughed and shouted something about beginner's luck. I looked at the joint. It wasn't cracked, but the mallet had left a small, ugly dent on the shoulder of the dovetail. To anyone else, it was invisible, but to me, it was a glaring scar. My vision blurred for a moment. The pressure of the debt, the fear of losing the shop, and the crushing weight of being watched were all crashing down on me. I stood there frozen, the mallet heavy in my hand. I felt that familiar iron gate in my throat getting heavier, making it hard to even breathe. I was ready to put my tools away and walk out. But then I looked at the grain of the walnut again. It looked like a path through a dark forest. I realized that if I walked away now, I wasn't just losing a shop, I was letting the silence win. I picked up a damp cloth and a soldering iron, an old trick to steam out a dent. I wasn't going to talk to the crowd, but I was damn sure going to talk to this wood. The steam trick worked. The tiny dent on the dovetail shoulder swelled out, leaving only a faint trace that only I would ever notice. It was a small victory, but in that moment, it felt like I'd just won the entire competition. With the mallet incident behind me, a new kind of focus settled in. It wasn't the frantic, anxious kind of focus I usually had. It was a calm, steady rhythm. The noise of the crowd, the whirring of Marcus's machines, even the glare of the sun, it all receded into a dull hum. I was back in my workshop, just me and the wood. I began working faster, but not carelessly. Each cut was precise, each chisel stroke deliberate. The drawers for the spirit cabinet were designed to fit so snugly that they would create a vacuum seal when closed, requiring no hardware. It was a testament to patience and exact measurement, and it was the part of the design I was most proud of. I could feel the quality of the walnut, the way it yielded to the blade, the subtle scent it released with each pass of my plane. This wasn't just wood, it was a story waiting to be told, and I was its narrator, using my hands instead of my voice. The judges made their second round. Mr. Abernathy stopped at my booth again, this time with a slightly different expression. His stern face held a hint of curiosity. He watched me as I carefully planed a piece of veneer for one of the hidden compartments. He didn't ask any questions this time, which was a huge relief. He just watched, his gaze moving from my hands to the evolving cabinet. I could feel his eyes, but this time it didn't make me shrink. It felt observational, like he was seeing the wood, not just the quiet girl holding the tools. Still with the hand tools, I see, he finally mumbled, more to himself than to me. He then reached out and gently ran a finger over the freshly planed surface of the walnut. His eyes widened slightly. Remarkable. That finish is velvet. And the dovetails, perfectly flush. He made another note on his clipboard, and this time, I could almost hear the positive tone in the scratch of his pen. It was a tiny moment, but it was enough to make the corners of my mouth lift in the smallest, almost imperceptible smile. Marcus, however, was having a different kind of day. His loud confidence was starting to crack. He had tried to rush a complex miter joint on his large maple display cabinet, and the pieces weren't aligning. I could hear him muttering under his breath, snapping at his assistants. The crowd around his booth, which had been so boisterous earlier, was starting to thin, some people drifting over to my station out of curiosity. I kept my head down, but I couldn't help but notice the small clusters of people now quietly watching me work. They weren't laughing anymore. They were just watching. The feeling was still a little unsettling, but it wasn't the crushing weight of judgment. It was different. It was the quiet attention you give to someone who is truly absorbed in their craft. I felt a tiny, fragile sense of belonging. The cabinet was nearing completion, and it was going to be beautiful. The 6-hour mark hit, and the square felt like a pressure cooker. Most of the other competitors were in the frantic assembly stage, the air filled with the frantic tapping of hammers and the smell of quick-dry epoxy. Marcus was sweating through his white shirt now, his face a bright shade of pink that matched his frustration. He was struggling with a warped panel, trying to force it into place with heavy-duty clamps that groaned under the tension. I could hear the wood protesting, a faint creaking sound that made my own teeth ache. He was fighting the material, trying to bend it to his will, while I was still whispering to mine. I moved on to the most difficult part of the spirit cabinet, the central locking mechanism. It was a wooden pin system, hidden behind a decorative inlay. If you didn't know the exact spot to press, the main drawer wouldn't budge. It required the kind of precision that usually took days, not hours. My fingers were sore, and my eyes were burning from the fine dust, but my shyness had retreated into a small corner of my mind. It was still there, a tiny voice warning me that everyone was looking, but the voice of the walnut was louder. It told me that the grain was perfect, that the fit was true, and that I belonged here. A small girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, wandered away from her parents and stood right at the edge of my workbench. She was so close I could see the freckles on her nose. Usually, a stranger this close would make me freeze, but she was looking at the wood with such pure wonder that I didn't feel the usual panic. She pointed at a thin curl of walnut on the floor. "Is that real chocolate?" she asked in a tiny voice. I didn't look up, but I found myself answering before I could stop myself. "No," I whispered. "It's a tree's memory." The girl's eyes went wide, and she looked at the cabinet like it was a magical artifact. I felt a strange warmth in my chest. I hadn't stuttered. I hadn't looked at my boots. For 3 seconds, I had just been a person sharing a secret about the thing I loved. Her parents eventually came and ushered her away, apologizing for the intrusion, but the interaction stayed with me. It felt like a crack in the glass wall I lived behind. If I could talk to a child about wood, maybe the world wasn't as terrifying as I'd convinced myself it was. With 2 hours left, I started the final sanding. I didn't use a machine. I used a series of hand scrapers and fine grit paper, feeling every inch of the surface for imperfections. Marcus was already applying a thick, glossy lacquer to his maple piece, the fumes wafting over into my station. It was a flashy finish, designed to hide the gaps in his joinery under a layer of plastic-like shine. My cabinet, however, was going to be finished with a simple, hand-rubbed wax. I wanted people to be able to feel the wood, not the chemical. My hands were moving in long, rhythmic strokes, the walnut beginning to glow with a deep, inner light. I was tired, my back was screaming, but I could see the finish line. I could see the shop being saved. And for the first time in my life, I could see myself standing tall. The final hour was a blur of silence and motion. While the other booths were filled with the sounds of panic, last-minute sanding, the frantic clicking of metal hardware, and Marcus barking orders at his exhausted assistants, my station felt like a small island of calm. I was applying the final coat of beeswax. The smell was heavenly, a mix of honey and the deep, earthy scent of the walnut. As I buffed the surface with a soft lint-free cloth, the wood began to sing. The grain popped, revealing those stormy, swirling patterns that had drawn me to this specific slab years ago. It didn't look like furniture anymore. It looked like a piece of the forest had been captured and frozen in time. I could feel a crowd growing behind the velvet ropes of my station. The murmurs weren't about my shyness anymore. People were pointing at the seamless joins, the way the light danced across the hand-scraped surface, and the sheer audacity of building something so complex with nothing but hand tools. I kept my head down, but I didn't feel like I was hiding anymore. I was protecting the work. I was finishing the conversation I had started with the timber. Across the way, Marcus's maple cabinet was a towering, shiny monolith of lacquer. From a distance, it looked impressive, but as the sun hit it at a low angle, the flaws became obvious: the visible glue lines, the slightly mismatched grain, and the plastic-like sheen that made the wood look dead. The head judge, Mr. Abernathy, blew the final whistle. "Hands up," he shouted. I dropped my buffing cloth and stepped back, my legs nearly giving out. From under me, I was shaking, but not from fear. It was the kind of exhaustion that feels like an accomplishment. I looked at my hands. They were stained dark with walnut dust and wax, my fingernails short and worn. I had never felt more like myself. Marcus let out a triumphant yell, high-fiving his assistants, while I just stood there, staring at my boots, trying to regulate my breathing. The judges began their final inspection. They spent a long time at Marcus's booth. I could hear him talking their ears off, pointing out the bold lines and the modern aesthetic of his piece. He was a salesman to the very end. Then, they moved to mine. The square went quiet as Mr. Abernathy approached. He didn't look at me at first. He walked around the spirit cabinet 3 times, his hands behind his back. He leaned in so close to the dovetails that his nose almost touched the wood. Then he reached out to open the main drawer. I held my breath. If the humidity from the crowd had caused the wood to swell too much, the drawer would stick, and the vacuum seal effect would be ruined. The silence in the square was so heavy I could hear the distant cry of a hawk circling above the trees. Mr. Abernathy's hand gripped the small, hand-carved handle of the main drawer. He pulled. There was no grinding, no resistance. Just the smooth, silent glide of perfectly fitted wood against wood, followed by a soft whoosh of air as the vacuum seal broke. He closed it, and the drawer slid back home with a gentle, satisfying thump that felt like a heartbeat. The other 2 judges whispered to each other, their faces illuminated by the warm glow of the walnut. Mr. Abernathy finally looked up, his eyes meeting mine. For the first time, I didn't look away. "Specialist Raven," he said, his voice echoing through the quiet crowd. In 40 years of judging this invitational, I have seen many. People master their tools, but very few master the silence required to truly listen to the wood. This isn't just a cabinet. It's a masterclass in patience. He turned to the crowd and raised his hand. "The first prize and the contract for the new City Hall archives goes to the person who let her work speak for itself." The crowd erupted. It was a wall of sound, cheering, clapping, whistling. Marcus's face went from pink to a ghostly, stunned white, his shiny maple cabinet suddenly looking like a cheap toy in the shadow of the walnut. I didn't give a speech. I couldn't have even if I wanted to. My throat was still that iron gate, but as Mr. Henderson, my landlord, pushed through the crowd with a massive grin to shake my hand, I realized I didn't need to be the loudest person in the room to belong in it. I had saved the shop. I had saved my father's workbench. But more importantly, I had proven to myself that my shyness wasn't a cage, it was just the quiet before the creation. As I started to pack my tools into my old truck, Marcus walked by, his head down, his assistants trailing behind him like defeated shadows. He didn't wave this time. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving the square in a soft, purple twilight. I sat on the tailgate of my truck, a cold bottle of water in my hand, watching the workers start to dismantle the tents. I knew that tomorrow, the phone at the shop would probably start ringing. People would want to see the spirit cabinet, and they would want to meet the girl who built it. I'd still be shy. I'd probably still stare at my boots and stumble over my words when the local paper came for an interview. But as I ran my thumb over a fresh callus on my palm, I smiled. Let them come. I'll just show them the wood and we'll let it do the talking. I'm Raven, and I'm a woodworker. And for the first time, the silence felt exactly like home.